Welcome to President Lincoln's Cottage. I'm Erin Carlson-Mast, and I'm the Executive Director here. I'm delighted to have you all here with us this evening. Please take a moment to silence your phones. We are recording this, and we want to be able to hear the speakers tonight. At the conclusion of tonight's Q&A, following the talk, we invite you to the book signing downstairs in the library. Support for Cottage Conversations, and this is the fourth of this series, our next one's in May, comes from Mr. David Bruce Smith, one of our board members who's here with us this evening, Mr. James Tenney's, and Mr. Matthew Tenney's. Our next Cottage Conversation is on May 19th, that's a Thursday, and it's with Sidney Blumenthal discussing his book, Self-Made Man, The Political Life of Abraham Lincoln from 1809 to 1849. Joining us tonight is Dr. Robert Levine and Cosby Hunt to discuss Dr. Levine's new book, The Lives of Frederick Douglass. Robert S. Levine is Professor of English and Distinguished University Professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, where he has been teaching since 1983. He received his PhD at Stanford University, and he is the author of Conspiracy and Romance, Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass, and the Politics of Representative Identity, and Dislocating Race and Nation. And he has edited or co-edited over 20 volumes, including a cultural and critical edition of Frederick Douglass's The Heroic Slave. He is also the general editor of the Norton Anthology of American Literature. He has received He has received fellowships from the NEH and the Guggenheim Foundation. In 2014, the American Literature section of the Modern Language Association awarded him the Hubble Medal for Lifetime Achievement in American Literary Studies. Cosby Hunt is a native Washingtonian, senior manager for social studies education at Center for Inspired Teaching, and adjunct professor at the University of the District of Columbia. He created DC's first citywide high school history course, an applied history course called Real World History. After earning his bachelor's degree, he's a proud University of Pennsylvania Quaker. He joined Teach for America and taught in Hancock, Georgia. After earning his master's from the University of Georgia, he spent the next 13 years teaching at Bell Multicultural High School here in DC, and that's where he was, I believe, when we first got him. He was named the 2008 DC History Teacher of the Year and is currently serving on the U.S. History Standing Committee for the Nation's Report Card, part of the National Assessment of Education Progress. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Levine.
Hey everybody. Hey. C-SPAN was supposed to be here, but I think they chose Trump over us. So when Bob and I break into a fist fight, they're going to be really sorry. This is a real treat for me to talk about Frederick Douglass, and to do so in the company of someone as esteemed as Dr. Levine. I think that Mr. Douglass is probably one of the reasons why, and I'll pass this around, every kid in this picture 35 years ago, if you asked them to sing the first verse of the Negro National Anthem today, they could do it. Because that's just what we did at Lafayette Elementary School 35 years ago. And I think that Mr. Douglass is part of the reason for that. My wife has seen this a million times. And I think that Mr. Douglass is also one of the reasons why our oldest son, his name is Freeman. So I have a lifelong debt to Mr. Douglass. And it's really exciting for me. I have, a member of my soccer team here, my wife, my mother's senior prom date is here. People that I grew up with, childhood friends are here, so this is real. My other mother is here, and so this is a real treat. Should we start with the title, The Lives of Frederick Douglass? Could you explain? I'm going to call you Bob. That's good. Okay. Could you explain what those lives are?
Yeah, so can I kind of run with the question?
Yes.
I got really interested in Frederick Douglass's autobiographies, and I was particularly interested in the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which some of you, or maybe most of you have read. That was published in 1845. And I was going to write something about that, and to do some of my research, I went to the Library of Congress and started reading Frederick Douglass's newspapers on microfilm, and I said, this guy's really interesting. And so the 1845 life of Frederick Douglass, the narrative, kind of step back. Frederick Douglass is born in 1818, and he's a slave in the Eastern Shore of Maryland. He escapes from Baltimore in 1838. He makes his way to New Bedford in he leaves there in 1841. That's where he meets William Lloyd Garrison, the great white abolitionist. And Douglass speaks at an anti-slavery meeting and electrifies the crowd, and Garrison signs him up. And this is not a short answer to your question, just to warn you. So by 1845, Douglass publishes his life with Garrison's organization. And that's, you could say, the life. And so then we get to the plurals. Frederick Douglass in 1845, because he is still a fugitive slave and is now famous for writing a best-selling autobiography, has to make an escape. He goes to England, Ireland, the British Isles, and he starts working on, kind of reworking a bit, the first life. And he brings out two Irish editions in 1845 and 1846, which no one reads, and very few people outside of Ireland know about, and I got really fascinated with those. And as I know a lot of people in this room know, Douglass eventually has his freedom purchased for him in 1846. He makes his way back to the United States in 1847, and he starts his newspaper, the North Star, which is kind of my introduction to the interesting Douglass, and eventually breaks with William Lloyd Garrison. He argues that Garrison was a racist and a paternalistic kind of anti-slavery person, and in 1855 he writes a second autobiography called My Bondage and My Freedom. And it's fascinating, and the first one is the one that's often taught, because it's vivid and powerful, and it's 100 pages. The second one, I think is vivid and powerful. It's about 200, 250 pages. But it takes Douglass's life to about 1850. And it's not just a second autobiography, but it's like it's a second life. He's broken apart from Garrison. He's broken particularly from Garrison's notion of nonviolence. He argues that slavery is an act of violence against black people, and they have the right to use violence against them. And to kind of move to an end to my response here, Douglass lives to 1895. And that to me was really fascinating, because 1845, that's the book that I was reading. And then I got really engaged with his third big autobiographical project called Life and Times of Frederick Douglass that he brings out in 1881. And it's hardly ever taught. I don't think many people read it. It might have to do with the fact that it's over 600 pages. I just bought it. But I fell in love with it because it has Douglass's encounters with Abraham Lincoln and John Brown and a whole bunch of other fascinating things in it. And then in 1891-92, published in 1892, Douglass decides to expand the life and times. So you could say, well, there's three main autobiographies, but there's the first one, and then there's the two Irish versions, there's the second one, and then the third one that comes late in his life that he does two editions of. And the 1892 adds a whole big final section about his second marriage, which happened to a white woman, about going to Egypt, about being an ambassador, an agent in, a U.S. ambassador in Haiti. So I see there are multiple autobiographies, and I think that there are, in some ways, multiple ways of thinking about the lives. And it's a life that is constantly changing. It's a life that Douglass is constantly revising, both as he's living it and as he's writing it. And the last thing I'll say in response to your question, this book is about those autobiographies in the way that you can kind of do a biography of Douglass from the autobiographies, not just by reading them straight, but by reading a whole bunch of other autobiographical writings by Douglass, and we've been talking about that. So it's not just that he writes the big books. he gives lectures about his life, he does essays about his life. And for me, what's really fascinating, and I am coming out of an English department, so I'm a literary critic, what's really fascinating is how the lives sometimes contradict each other. There are different kinds of stories that he tells about his life. So the kind of challenge of working on this book was to try to not do what a historian might do, and say, this is the life, but to kind of say, here are the lives. And there are different ways of thinking about Douglass, and Douglass thinks about himself in different ways as well. And I promise all the rest of my answers will be short.
I love it when one answer dovetails into the next question. I love the phrase that you use, that Douglass's autobiographical style is performative. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Douglass was an orator. He was famous in the 19th century for being an orator. As the two of us are doing right now, we are in front of people, we are thinking about how to interest them. We're thinking about what we want to share with them and what we don't want to share with them. So I think Douglass, in his 19th century life, was a renowned orator. He was, according to a recent book, the most widely photographed American of the 19th century. He liked to stage himself, and particularly, I think, with the last autobiography, and that's the autobiography, Life and Times, he's talking about Lincoln, and he's talking about John Brown, and he's talking about his reunion that he has with his former slave master. Yeah, I think that he's kind of putting on a show in some ways. Another way of putting this is that, let's say he's a performer in the kind of P.T. Barnum way or Shakespearean actor way, but a really great rhetorician, which means that you know your audience, you know how to work the audience, and you work different audiences in different ways. And that's one of the things that fascinates me about his writing, about looking at speeches, essays, and autobiographies in different kinds of contexts, and imagining the different readers and audiences that he's performing to.
Let's back up to the first autobiography, the narrative. You wrote that the narrative was in some respects a commodity coming from Garrison's anti-slavery office, more than from Douglass himself.
I said that? I said that near the end of my chapter. So, I think that what started to bother Douglass was the way that Garrison was taking ownership of his life. And what I look at near the end of the chapter in the narrative, and I think a lot of the narrative is very much Douglass. I mean, it's very powerfully Douglass. But what I look at near the end of the first chapter that's on the narrative is the way that Garrison was selling it in his newspaper, the way that he was promoting it in his newspaper, the way it became kind of like a Garrisonian or a Massachusetts anti-slavery production, more than Douglass's own books. So what happens when he goes abroad to England is he brings boxes of his books with him, and he's selling them on the ship that's taking him from Massachusetts to Liverpool, which is where he ended up. And I think he got really excited that he could sell this, he could make money. Hey, why not do my own edition in Ireland? He sells out. I have a letter in there where he's so excited, I want more because the first edition sells out. And a number of his speeches in Ireland are all about, at the end of my lecture, come buy my book. And yeah, do that.
So he's scheduled to speak on the ship. Is that, I'm trying to think of how he's selling books on the ship, and he's a featured speaker on the book.
He has boxes of books on the ship. He brought them abroad. I think he's still kind of linked with the Garrisonians. And he's asked on the ship to speak. And then people start asking for the book. And I think that then gets him excited about the possibility of creating his own edition in Ireland. And as you know from having read the book, when he's in Ireland, he wants to take it back from the white abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison. So he writes his own preface. And one of the things that people talk about when they look at slave narratives is how the prefaces are always written by white people, and the appendices are always by white people. And then people point to the 1855 My Bondage and My Freedom and say, Douglass got one of his best friends, James McCoon Smith, an African-American doctor, medical person, to write the introduction. But in the Dublin editions, Douglass writes the introduction. And I think that that's a kind of fascinating thing, and kind of showing how he's taking control of the book. And yeah, the books are meant to do something. I mean, they're about his passionate hatred of slavery, about the way he wants to present himself as human to white readers. But he's also really into book selling. And if you look, as I've looked at Frederick Douglass's paper that comes out around 1855, which is the year that he publishes My Bondage and My Freedom, everywhere you look, advertisements for My Bondage and My Freedom. And these kinds of things that you see in the New York Times today, blurbs from people, the sales records, and he does that for a couple of years. So yeah, and with The Life and Times, the last big book, he hoped that would be a mega bestseller, and it wasn't, and that was an enormous disappointment for him. But he's interested in books in part as commodities, in part as something he owns, and I think he puts his blood and passion into the books too. It's not contradictory.
Going to the 1850s and around the time of the second autobiography, he wrote a novella. Could you talk about how that novella represents at least one of his lives?
Yeah.
The heroic slave?
This might not be a short answer. Because last year I brought out an edition of The Heroic Slave, which is Douglass's only work of fiction. And if you want to see Douglass as a fiction writer, this wonderful edition from Yale University Press is only $9.95. But let me just say a few words about the novella. Douglass, while he's in England, becomes really interested in the Creole mutiny, slave rebellion, which occurred in 1841. A ship was going from Virginia to New Orleans, and Madison Washington, one of the black slaves, led a rebellion that resulted in the loss of one white life, 2 black lives, and the slaves get to the British Bahamas and get their freedom. And what really appealed to Douglass about that, I mean, a number of things, including, hey, maybe Garrison isn't right about nonviolence, because look what happened in the slave rebellion. He's in England, and he's being sheltered by England. And Madison Washington and the rebels are being sheltered by the British Bahamas. And he feels this real intense sense of identification. So one of the things that I trace both in the edition of The Heroic Slave and in the book is the way that Douglass starts giving lectures on Madison Washington, and I think increasingly invests himself in this figure. And it's like a fantasy, a heroic fantasy. So in 1853, Douglass publishes this novella in something called Autographs for Freedom, which is a collection of anti-slavery writings that was put together by Julia Griffiths, a British woman who became the managing editor of his newspaper. And so it's a bunch of anti-slavery writings in there by whites and by blacks. And then he serializes the same novella in his newspaper. And it's a novella about the slave rebellion, in which he invents a white guy who hears Madison Washington in Virginia talking about wanting his freedom, and he becomes an abolitionist. And I think that that's Douglass's fantasy. You give a speech or a soliloquy that's anti-slavery, and this guy says, I become an anti-slavery person, and then he helps him. By the end of the novella, which I think is fascinating and great, and it's inspired in part by his love for, but somewhat critical view of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was the big bestseller of 1852. By the end, Madison Washington is free. He's in the British Bahamas. He's being celebrated by black soldiers in the Bahamas. And 2 years later, Douglass publishes My Bondage and My Freedom. And in this book, I draw what I hope are exciting, revelatory connections about thinking about the novella in relation to the autobiography. Because in the autobiography, as opposed to the 1845 autobiography, Douglass is much more the anti-Garrisonian who is advocating for violence and for kind of black community, and puts, in the first autobiography, the narrative, it's more the heroic individualism. In the second, it's more Douglass trying to link himself up with his fellow black slaves, and when in a famous scene that some of you probably know, when he rises up against Covey, the slave breaker, in the 1845 narrative, he does it by himself. In the 1855 version, there's a bunch of other slaves who are involved with him. And yeah, so I think that Douglass in some ways discovers a part of himself through his fascination with Madison Washington, who he writes about and gives speeches about from 1845 until 1851, and then writes the novella in 1852 and publishes it in 1853. And kind of the story that I tell in the book is about how Douglass moves from working with Garrison and aligning himself with Garrison's beliefs to making a public break in 1851 and saying, I don't believe in moral suasion anymore. I don't believe in the idea that we should break apart from the political system, which was what Garrison argued, that the whole system is corrupt, so you shouldn't even vote. And Douglass gets involved in what people call political abolition. And Douglass is infuriated by the fugitive slave law, and in the early to mid-1850s is involved in riots in Boston that take place when fugitive slave hunters come north and try to bring fugitive slaves back to Boston. And one of these people is killed, and Douglass celebrates that. Says, you know, God would be happy. And that's a very different Douglass from in the mid-1840s, when he speaks to peace organizations, the Quakers. I mean, he actually gives a speech to a peace society in 1846 in England, and says he would never use violence. It doesn't matter how bad violence is to the slaves. Perhaps by thinking about Madison Washington, by being exposed to a range of other kinds of abolitionists, he moves away from Garrison. And eventually, for a short period of time, they really come to hate each other. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
I'm saving that for the end a little bit. I work at a place called Center for Inspired Teaching, and we believe in transforming the classroom experience for young people. And this classroom is so quiet, so we're gonna change that up a little bit. On the handout that you had, that was waiting for you when you got to your seat, there are a number of quotes. All of them are from Mr. Douglass. And I want you to turn to your partner, and your elbow partner, as we like to say in our classroom. And with your elbow partner, just make a decision about whether Douglass is talking about John Brown or Abraham Lincoln in each quote. You should grab
It's not about the same person.
Okay, so, A, anybody? Is he talking about Brown or Lincoln?
Brown.
Oh, I got Brown. Okay. B.
Brown.
C.
Brown.
I love it. No consensus. Okay. D.
Brown.
Okay. E.
Brown.
Good, I love lack of consensus. F.
Lincoln.
And G.
Lincoln.
The only two quotes about Abraham Lincoln are the first and the last. You should. I'm going to read A and then I'm going to read G because that takes us to the next question. This man is quite a genuine representative of American prejudice and Negro hatred, and far more concerned for the preservation of slavery and the favor of the border slave states than for any sentiment of magnanimity or principle of justice and humanity. Okay. Now, if you know that the year is 1862, that might help you a little bit because Douglass is just so frustrated with Lincoln for a number of reasons that Bob can elaborate on, but it's, of course, the war is happening. And some things are happening with the progression of the war that, some things are not happening that Douglass wished would happen. Now, I take you to G in 1881, and the passage of time heals all wounds. I shall never forget my first interview with this great man. There was no vain pomp and ceremony about him. I was never more quickly or more completely put at ease in the presence of a great man than in that of Abraham Lincoln. So, Bob, I guess what I'd like to ask is what happened between 1862 and 1881?
Yeah. So this might be one of the longer. In the lifetimes of Frederick Douglass, that comes out in 1881, Douglass, when he introduces Lincoln, says, I supported him. The moment he was elected, I knew he was great. He was going to bring about the end of slavery. And then he describes 3 meetings that he has with Abraham Lincoln. One in 1863 to talk about equal pay for black soldiers. One in 1864 in which Lincoln asked him, how can we use the slaves to help us end the war? And he's there for the second inaugural in 1865. And in the Life and Times, you get an account of those 3 meetings. And they love each other, they respect each other. And this leads, I think, to what I call in the chapter called Tales of Abraham Lincoln, and I put in parentheses, and John Brown. This is a kind of mythologizing of that relationship, and you see that in a lot of the scholarship about Lincoln and Douglass. By my estimation, they may have met for an hour, if that, over 3 years. And what I think happened, I think that Douglass admired him. I don't want to be too cynical, but I think that what happened is that when Lincoln was assassinated, Douglass starts telling different stories about Lincoln. It's the stories about his greatness. He was the saint. And it pays. People love Lincoln. Douglass becomes part of the Republican Party. By the time of 1881, he's Marshal of the District of Columbia. And he, like Walt Whitman, who also talked about his friendship with Lincoln and actually claimed to have been there in Ford's Theater when Lincoln was shot and killed, and he wasn't there. And then gave lectures everywhere about that. But there was something to that. It helped your celebrity status. And again, I don't want to get too cynical because I think that Douglass really cared about Lincoln. So what interested me are these different stories that Douglass tells about Lincoln. So yeah, I loved him from the moment he was elected. You go back to what was at that time called Douglass's Monthly. That's his periodical. He has this particular, all these quotes are from the chapter. He has this particular statement about Lincoln. He also says in 1862 that we might have been better off electing Jefferson Davis over Lincoln. He's incredibly critical. When he meets with him in 1863, celebrates that meeting in his autobiography, but I found speeches he gave. And he makes it all into a kind of joke about the country bumpkin Lincoln who has his feet up on a table and seems distracted. And Douglass comes into the room and Lincoln starts standing up and keeps rising and rising and rising and rising. And I have a quote in the book from the speech where every other sentence has the word laughter because it's a reporter reporting on the speech. People found it riotously funny. Right after Douglass meets with Lincoln in 1863, he's appalled that Lincoln failed to speak out about the killing of black people in the New York City draft riots. And he writes about that. He remains convinced, and I think maybe correctly, that Lincoln would do anything to end the Civil War, including allowing the border states to keep their slaves. He also was concerned about Lincoln's interest in black colonization, in shipping blacks or ridding the nation of blacks by getting them to Central and South America. So I see a lot of tension in that relationship. At the same time, I see Douglass was thrilled to meet this person who's talking to him. I mean, you could actually go wait in line and talk to the president, and he was even summoned to meet with Lincoln. To work against some of the mythologizing of this relationship, I triangulate into the discussion Douglass's friendship with John Brown. And that, I think, was a real friendship. They met in 1848. They saw each other off and on between 1848 and 1849. John Brown stays with Douglass for 2 weeks to write his provisional constitution in 1858. In a weird moment that you mentioned to me, Douglass meets with Brown shortly before he leads the attack on Harper's Ferry. He's living in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And at that point, as Douglass tells the story, he decided he wasn't going to join him because he thought it was a suicidal mission. Right after the attack on Harper's Ferry, Douglass had to get out of the country as fast as possible because people knew about the friendship. There was plenty of evidence that they were connected, and he was afraid of being hung. And he kind of held back a bit on telling about the story of his friendship with Brown and the fact they actually met with him 2 weeks before the attack. So in a way, he is a co-conspirator because he knew about the plot. But he never kind of renounces it or pulls back from him because he honestly felt that John Brown regarded him in a post-racial or non-racial way, that John Brown could see past race. And that's the thing I think he thought that Lincoln ultimately couldn't do. That Lincoln was strongly anti-slavery, but he never had that kind of same feeling of someone who talked to him on a totally equal human level. So, so I talked about that, about the really fascinating relationship that he has with John Brown, and the way in which, as you get to the Life and Times, he's able to tell much more of the story. And then I focus on how, whenever he's talking about Lincoln, he's often talking about Brown. That Brown is always kind of like haunting the relationship because there is something about Brown that he found so appealing. And as to whether or not he found Harper's Ferry suicidal, maybe he did. I was recently talking to someone who's working on a biography of Douglass who claimed to have found evidence that Douglass's 2 sons were interested in joining John Brown. Maybe he was trying to protect his sons from being killed. His sons eventually fought with the Union Army. So part of what I do, the method of the book is to look at lots of different stories and lots of different accounts. And there is a very, very, very moving account of Douglass and Lincoln in Life and Times that I do not undercut by finding other stories. And that's at the second inaugural. And according